Cool. I guess, yeah, let's do it. Let's do this. It is 4:02 and we are ready to go. Hello, everybody. Yeah, let's get started. So it's just gonna be me and you, I guess.
Okay.
Just chatting about good stuff. There we go. I like it. Appreciate that.
Is that good fireside?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, really timely. Good stuff. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our virtual fireside chat today on COVID and sustainability. I caught the tail end of the program last time, just before us, and they spent about 45 minutes not talking about COVID, and COVID is the first word that I'm going to say here. I will first introduce myself. So I am the co-founder of SUSTAINHK. It's a platform that convenes dialogues to spur industry-level action and public awareness on climate change. In my day job, I am the founder and CEO of Epiphany Labs, which is a boutique innovation consultancy that brings innovation and systems change methodologies into various social sectors, focusing on education, environmental sustainability, and SDG awareness. I'm the curator right now of the Global Shapers community here in Hong Kong. The Global Shapers is a youth leadership initiative of the World Economic Forum. So I'm really happy to be joined by my friend Nate Maynard, who is dialing in today from Taipei. So hey Nate, thanks for dialing in.
Hi Vince, yes, dialing in from free and open Taipei. I'm actually at my podcast recording studio. It's behind the flames.
Good stuff. So we're both part of the Global Shapers community, which I've just briefly introduced. And we've been talking about collaborating on sustainability initiatives for quite a while now. So I'm really excited to be picking his brain on this important topic. So quick introduction on Nate. So Nate works at the Chung-Hua Institution for Economic Research, which is a think tank in Taiwan, where he researches energy, ocean, and waste issues. He organizes circular economy workshops, researches waste, and helps companies use 100% renewable electricity. He hosts the podcast Waste Not, Why Not, a sustainability science show with a focus on trash and greenwashing, and is currently the vice curator of the Global Shapers Taipei Hub. Again, the Global Shapers is a youth leadership initiative of the World Economic Forum. So we have 30 minutes, so let's get right to it. And if anybody in the audience has any questions that they'd like to pose to Nate, feel free to dump them in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on what's going on in the chat, so I'll pose them to Nate as they come up. But first, I'll get things started. So our headline today is that COVID-19 was a sustainability mirage. We need real environmental systems change. So there's a narrative over the past few months that COVID has been a blessing for our environments. We've all seen the pictures of wildlife supposedly returning to urban environments in other places. We've read reports of lower carbon emissions from the manufacturing shutdown. We've been fed the story that COVID is the wake-up call and blessing in disguise in the climate action movement. Nate, I know you believe strongly that COVID was not good for the environment. Yeah. Why is that?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think that even thinking that coronavirus is somehow good for the environment is kind of coming from a place of privilege, because a lot of the people who are suffering the most from climate change, who are already suffering from income inequality, probably haven't noticed a tremendous shift in their lifestyles. If you're a food delivery person, you're still delivering food. You know, if you're working on the front lines of medicine, or you're working in logistics, you work at a power company, waste collector, you're still basically having the same job, more or less. But for kind of the high income people who work in offices, who maybe travel for work, they're noticing a change. And according to Carbon Brief, we've seen that carbon emissions have decreased, they estimate, something around 10% due to the various lockdowns. And there are some positives to coronavirus. It's not just purely not sustainable. However, I think that it's dangerous to say that something like coronavirus or COVID is good for the environment, because then you start to create this really gruesome calculus about, yeah, I mean, it would be sustainable as if there were no people on Earth. There would be, the planet would be fine. But that's obviously not what we want. We want a world where we can live with nature and with each other and have that be a good life.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about environmental systems change, right? So I know in Taiwan, you do a lot of research on different kinds of systems relating to sustainability. So I know you focus on waste management, recycling, a lot of other areas that Taiwan really excels, right? So can you share a little bit about how you approach your research, approach system change, and also what you think good systems level policy, and when it comes to the environment, looks like?
Sure. Taiwan's in a really specific situation. It's kind of similar to Hong Kong in some senses because 97% of Taiwan's energy is imported. That's total energy. So fuel, gas, coal, even nuclear, in some ways, the materials to make solar panels or wind turbines is imported. That's similar to Hong Kong and Japan. And because of that, the vast majority of Taiwan's environmental impact is going to be industrial. So 60% of Taiwan's total energy use is industrial, 40% comes from direct industry, and then another 20% comes from basically making plastics. I'm going to take off these plastic glasses so they don't bother me while I'm talking. And that's where the majority of that comes from. Most people don't know, but the single largest source of carbon emissions in the world is actually in Taiwan. Taiwan produces a tremendous amount of plastics. And so to that end, a lot of our work focuses on working with the Industrial Development Bureau. We work with their environmental policy team to try and increase circular manufacturing and industrial symbiosis. That's where you have factories sharing electricity and sharing energy and sharing steam. So take the Linhai industrial cluster in Kaohsiung. They used to have 154 fuel boilers. So every single factory basically had their own fuel boiler so they could create heat for their industrial processes. Now, the China Steel Corporation, which is confusing, this is the Republic of China Steel Corporation, had their own tremendously large boilers because they were making steel. They found that they could redirect that steam and sell it to different companies within the industrial park. And then those companies didn't need to rely on their own steam fuel boilers anymore. So that's one example of sort of the industrial circular economy that doesn't necessarily touch people's lives directly, but is massively impactful environmentally because Linhai emits about 400,000 tons of CO2 emissions per year just from like the one steel facility there. And it's probably almost 1 million tons total from the entire industrial cluster, including the nearby Linhai. So that's the nearby Lingyuan. So that's just a tremendous amount of energy and emissions coming from one industrial cluster. And maybe it's decreased a little bit because economic output has fallen from coronavirus, but it's still going to be a lot of emissions. And the other thing that I want to include also is about coronavirus is that if we were to actually stop climate change, we would need to reduce our emissions by 10% from the baseline year of 2019, 10% every year until 2050. So we would have to have an enormous, think about how impactful coronavirus has been. We need to do this every year again until we reach 2050 in order to prevent catastrophic climate change. So I think that I'm not saying we should give up because it's too hard to do, but we can't just not do things to stop the environment. We need to have this kind of system level change. And part of that is identifying where the major sources of pollution come from. It's not a little bit of face mask litter. I know that bothers people, but when you have massive coal plants, that's an order of magnitude difference in impact.
This is really interesting. There seems to be quite a lot of collaboration actually within like the different industry players, especially when you're talking about manufacturing, right? So just the prospect of different players or different factories or companies working together on things like sort of electricity sharing and things like that, that seems to take a lot of like sort of competing interests, so to speak, across different companies. And that's like a pretty gargantuan task. So, just on surface level, who takes the lead on these types of discussions? Is it the regulators and the government, or, are the manufacturers in Taiwan, are they sort of forward thinking enough to be able to convene these types of roundtables to discuss these things?
I wish the manufacturers would take the lead, but in this particular case, China Steel is a state-owned enterprise. There was also Zhongyo, Formosa, China Petroleum. There was many state-owned or formerly state-owned enterprises in this industrial cluster. So it wasn't that the government forced them to do it, but rather that they felt comfortable collaborating with each other because they knew, okay, China Steel is going to be around for 10 years at least. So if I make this investment, it's not going to implode. There are other examples like in Europe and the Kallenberg Industrial Park, where they do eco-symbiosis is what they call it. And they will share water resources from one factory. They will share organic waste. They have a different model, but Kallenberg is kind of the international standard for industrial symbiosis. That, to my knowledge, was not led by the government, and instead that sort of organically formed between different companies. However, they had specific environmental encouragements or incentives in place to get them to do that. In the case of Taiwan, it's rather difficult because Taiwan sets its energy price not based on how much that energy costs to produce, but what the government believes is the economically efficient price for electricity. And so with that in mind, if you have a very low electricity price, it doesn't matter if you install your own fuel boiler because you're gonna be able to procure that energy very cheaply. However, if you have a high electricity price or a high energy price or a resource input price, like you might find in Europe, then they are going to try and find creative ways to do cost savings. So I'm not saying that this isn't necessarily replicatable, but you're going to need to make sure that the foundational principles are there. Otherwise, you're going to have to do top-down control.
Wow, that's a lot of really sort of nitty-gritty things that are actually pretty important to talk about, right? Because, you know, a lot of people are saying, you know, we can't really just be doing sustainability stuff just for the sake of it. Apparently for like the private sector, you know, capitalism and all of those things, we need to make sustainability economically attractive. So I guess when you're sort of factoring in like the different price settings and those types of policies, that makes it make more sense for people to participate in it. Now, you know, I want to flip it over a little bit into the waste management side. Because we are talking about you know, manufacturing, which is like producing stuff. So obviously there are things that come out as the byproducts of the manufacturing, and you focus quite a lot on, you know, waste management policy and recycling policy in Taiwan. How does that work? What are the sort of best practices there that you think are replicable? Are they, you know, do they take after like similar sort of price setting, economic-based things, or what's the sort of overall concept that you think is important?
Sure, that's a great question. You know, it's funny. I lived in Hong Kong before I ended up eventually moving and settling in Taiwan. And when I went to Hong Kong, you know, I worked at a plastics NGO, and we talked all the time about, you know, the problem with Hong Kong's waste. I'm not putting Hong Kong on blast, but I think it's, you know, good to bring up the fact that Hong Kong has so many nearby cities that have done almost the exact same thing. Tokyo, Seoul, Taipei, even Singapore have all basically done the same set of policies that have reduced their waste management. So a little bit of context about Taiwan, in case you don't know, it was under a military dictatorship for quite a long time. As soon as that ended, sort of around the early 1990s, people began to protest landfills because the government was trying to build landfills to deal with all the waste. Taiwan was becoming rich, it was producing more garbage, there was a lot of manufacturing, so they wanted to deal with that. People began, now that it was legal to do so, they began legally protesting those landfills. Then the government said, okay, fine, we won't build landfills, we'll build waste incinerators. Well, people don't want to live next to a waste incinerator either, so they started protesting those. They had planned to build 36, they ended up building about 23, and because there was that difference in the amount of waste incinerators that were planned versus the ones that were built, there's a need to develop recycling and to just reduce waste as a whole. So a combination of civil society, especially protest groups, one particular group called the Homemakers Association, which is a group of basically moms and grandmas who live at home. They wanted to make sure that recycling and waste reduction was a key part of Taiwan's overall waste strategy. So in the early 90s, Taiwan had a waste collection rate of 70%. That's today what Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam has. That means that 30% of your trash is going to be littered or not disposed of properly. Today, Taiwan has the 5th or the 3rd highest recycling rate in the world, depending on how you calculate it. And Taiwan's waste production per person has just continued to decrease over time. It has increased in recent years. We can talk about that later, but overall the trend has been downward for waste elimination. And you might be thinking, how do they do that, Nate? Well, they did that through extended producer responsibility, and in that you charge a fee on waste production. So every time it's like a bottle deposit, if you're familiar with that. You know, every time you make a bottle, the manufacturer has to pay into a fund, and that fund is then going to dispose of the bottle, or theoretically that those funds are set aside and earmarked for the disposal of that bottle. So in the beginning, that pays for things like recycling trucks, it pays for recycling infrastructure, transfer stations. It just helps fund waste management in general, which is a very acute problem for Southeast Asia. And it also disincentivizes the production of packaging or the production of products, because each product is going to cost marginally more. The other thing that was done at the same time was that for major cities and major urban areas in Taiwan, you had to pay as you throw is the term. You had to pay for the volume of waste that you dispose of. And because you do that, and then you make recycling free, suddenly if you're making packaging that costs money to dispose of for the consumer, that consumer does not want to buy that anymore. There's a subconscious signal that it is sending that they don't want to have to like spend all that money to dispose of something. So they did that, and then they just started doing bans. And then of course, they just banned specific materials. So Taiwan, as of today, has banned straws, they banned styrofoam, they banned various types of other materials. And even if you look at the design of products, they tend to be mono material. So it was a number of things. It was protests, it was certain policies, and it was the fact that they all happened together. If you look at the US does technically have types of extended producer responsibility, but there's not a federal waste law in the US that comprehensively covers every state. There's not a extended producer responsibility law that covers, the entire US, or even that covers an entire state. California is trying to put this on the ballot now, but they've been trying to do that for 10 years. And if you look at Hong Kong, to bring it back there, it's the same situation. Hong Kong doesn't have extended producer responsibility. People are not charged to dispose of the waste that they throw away. And that's why Hong Kong now wants to keep building more waste incinerators and things like that. So really just again, with the systemic change, getting the fundamentals right and either creating a law or a cost for disposal, making the polluter pay, is the way to create that kind of systemic change. If you can't do that because your government is unresponsive or whatever, you can create that cost in other ways. It's something I want to really hammer home is it's not just because Taiwan is an island that it's good at recycling, because Japan is also an island and Japan incinerates all of its waste. So Taiwan could have just done that too. And frankly, Taiwan could have just made a bunch of landfills. I mean, Taiwan's not like a tiny island. Taiwan chose to do recycling, or rather, the communities chose to do that through protest. And I think that's kind of the lesson to take home for other communities, that if you get involved with your waste management process, you can really make a difference. That's my rant.
That's that's a lot to
That's
there's
my
a lot to
spiel.
unpack there, because that's actually quite timely, because there was a waste management, like a waste levy, that was proposed, that's been taken off the table. I think a lot of people were talking about like the whole proposal not being comprehensive enough. So, but what I'm getting from this is, it's not like it just happened over a day, right? It's not just like someone decided, from a regulatory standpoint, to just be like, we're gonna do these and do these. It's a culmination of a lot of like many years of effort, a lot of foundations that were set, a lot of policies that started forming because of these foundations, whether they're like informal, civic, or formal. I guess I'd be really interested to see sort of like, you just sort of gave us like a 5-minute complete blast in the face in terms of like all of these sort of the timeline and the different moving pieces, right? I think having sort of that type of like a map, or like the different factors when they came, like what are these sort of prerequisites, in Taiwan's case, that would be a pretty interesting case study. So I also wanted to talk about, you mentioned obviously activism, and also individual sort of, levels of producing waste, managing waste ourselves, and also being proactive and voicing out our concerns, and voicing out simply, we don't want landfills and things like that, right? So, and you yourself, beyond doing your research work, you host a podcast talking about climate science. Right. You call out greenwashing, and you obviously share best practices and things like that, right? So from your standpoint, the hip term right now is zero waste lifestyles, right? But if we are looking to push for real change, and we don't have the access to, form the policies, and we're not sitting, within like these factories or manufacturers that can actually start working with each other to think about these sorts of guidelines and regulations. What does what does systems change look like for us beyond just living like a zero waste lifestyle, quote unquote? Is it activism? Is it learning from other territories like Taiwan in terms of best practices? What is it? Like, how do we sort of set up that sort of grassroots level awareness and continue to build that momentum?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it's Plastic Free July this month, and I think it's quite easy, being sort of a satirical environmental show, for me to make fun of people who try and be zero waste, because the underlying problem is not your individual action. The underlying problem is that, there's like the meme of there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. And that's kind of true. I mean, we are in an industrial machine that makes it impossible for us to make the right choice. And the things that people tend to react to the most negatively are plastic. I'm not pro-plastic by any means. Ban single-use plastic. However, at the same time, it's really difficult to beat a plastic bag in terms of its environmental benefits. So you going zero waste or you going plastic free is kind of a good activist move, but it shouldn't be the end all. And I think that a lot of people maybe give up or they think it's hard or messy, but you really need to be joining with activist groups. And I think, what you can learn from a country like Taiwan is that you can see different groups coming together and pushing for the government in a united voice. You being plastic free is just like, it's like the old, question, like if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, doesn't make a sound. I mean, if you're just some small time influencer and you're zero waste, doesn't make a sound. It's what you teach other people. And I think that just talking about zero waste can sometimes be very off-putting and feel judgmental, because then you start to think about, oh my God, I'm just creating so much trash. Can you be plastic free and drive a car? Can you be plastic free and use a laptop? I think these are really important questions. I think it's fun to analyze your waste, just like beach cleanups. Go to a beach cleanup, see where the trash comes from. But that's like the first step. And then you need to change your purchasing habits. You need to buy secondhand and use. Don't buy things at all. But repair, trade, barter, create the circular economy. These things are not easy to do though. And because they're not easy to do and they're complicated, they're not going to be simple hashtags and they're not going to be listicles. And so, if that's like what the show is saying, it's like, hey, stop. We need to have a conversation about this. We can't just, I think there's this desire on an environmentalist, and I feel this too, of just, let's just give people the simplest possible message so that they can, people are busy, they don't have time. But I think that's what got us into this situation. I think people need to meditate on how much they're purchasing, how much they're buying. Flying is part of it, sure, but it's not necessarily the only part, as we've seen with coronavirus. Planes are still flying, and sometimes empty planes are flying. We have this big machine. It's going to take a long time to change. And I could go on. I could keep going, but that's how I feel about Plastic Free July. Try it. Try it once just to see. But don't be that person who shames people. Shame works for some. Shame doesn't work for everyone. And a lot of people, you get the backlash effect where you shame them, you accuse them of something, and then they just shut down. Use humor. That's what I try and do.
Yeah, it's a very pertinent thing for you to say, especially seeing the ongoing effects of impacts of COVID and how people deal with it, and how people comment on behaviors that are not necessarily as desirable, if we want to put it that way. So
wear a mask.
Yeah, for sure. So we obviously I want to return back to the overall context. It is COVID, right? Do you see any parallels between how we can respond to COVID and how we can respond to the environment? Or am I completely missing the mark? Because I know that you're saying, like, your thesis is COVID is bad for the environment, right? Are there parallels? Are there actually silver linings or lessons learned? Or are we supposed to, should we be looking at like a different way of responding to the climate crisis, especially because that is such a, bigger beast in the overall scheme of things?
What's been striking to me seeing coronavirus unfold is that it's the same problem as climate change. We don't listen to scientists. It's very difficult for people as a whole to take risk seriously. 2% transmission risk if you're wearing a mask sounds like it's not very much, but when it could mean, catastrophic destruction, or things like, oh, you just get sick, or even, oh, coronavirus, it just hurts your lungs, but you'll recover. Well, it's like saying, oh, there'll just be sea level rise. Or, oh, there'll just be severe droughts. Well, these things are quite serious. They might sound cavalier, but the impacts of climate change or environmental destruction are very grave. Oh, we'll just lose some species. It's inevitable. Just lose some species. Just lose some ecosystems. I mean, that's serious. So I see a lot of the same parallels. I don't think we should unquestioningly trust scientists, but I think that we should listen to and incorporate scientists far more than what we're doing in the policy discussion. I mean, the U.S. Man, I could say a lot of different things about the U.S. right now, but let's keep it, focused on our part of the world, the Asia Pacific, I think that most of these countries have done quite well in terms of dealing with coronavirus, because coronavirus is a relatively short time horizon of just 2 weeks. However, all of these countries, that have done reasonably well are doing pretty poorly on climate change. If you look at Hong Kong, for example, it's hard to build renewable energy there, just the way Hong Kong's set up. If you look at Vietnam, similarly, Vietnam's investing in wind power, but they still depend largely on coal plants. There's a lot of historical reasons for that too. I'm worried that it's so difficult to get the entire world to come together on what is basically a witnessable impact within like a 2-week time horizon, whereas climate change is like a decade time horizon, and we're experiencing it now. This is going to be the hottest summer probably that we've experienced, and I have to say probably because that's how climate change works. You can't just say with certainty. Similarly with coronavirus, I can't say you're going to get coronavirus, but if you do X, Y, and Z, you're likely to get it. I see a lot of parallels there. I think one silver lining is probably work from home. What we're doing now. I'm not flying to Hong Kong to participate in this conference, which is a pity. I like Hong Kong, but at the same time, maybe there are things that we can do remotely and we can still benefit from that. Maybe people can work from home and they don't have to commute to work. If we can reduce the environmental impacts, why not? Maybe coronavirus, maybe we can learn something out of all of this tragedy. And I wouldn't say necessarily that coronavirus is bad for the environment. I would just say that coronavirus is not good for the environment, and that it's just sort of shifted things. Like in the US, there's it sounds embarrassing, but there's just not a lot of toilet paper. And that's not because the US doesn't have toilet paper. It's because toilet paper had to shift from offices and restaurants and retail markets to residential, which is not what that supply chain was set up to do. So if anything, coronavirus exposes how fragile our supply chains are, which is really bad for climate change. I obviously have a fire behind me, but I'm not that pessimistic. But coronavirus has made me just like a tad more pessimistic. Maybe this is a learning opportunity. There are people gardening. There are people realizing that work from home is possible. So maybe it's a window for growth, but it's certainly not guaranteed, especially if you look at how countries around the world are reacting.
I think you're being kind to yourself by saying you're not pessimistic. I know how you really feel.
We got to practice self-care, Vince.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I think we're pretty much at the end of our discussion. So thanks a lot, Nate. I definitely learned a lot just from a 30-minute discussion. This really just means that we need to do more of these, and we really shouldn't be waiting like another few months or like another year or two before we have a chat like this. So for anybody who's interested in following Nate's rants, stat-based rants, science-based rants.
Science-based rants, that's the official term.
Follow Waste Not, Why Not. It's a podcast that Nate hosts. And please do follow us on Facebook. We're at Sustain Hong Kong, spelled in full. And I guess we'll start talking about how we can do more things between Hong Kong and Taiwan to share best practices on all the things that we talked about.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's talk again soon, Vince. It sounds good.
Cool. Yeah, so thanks again to Nate for joining us from Taiwan, and hope this was interesting for everybody in the audience.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.